to a literal interpretation of scriptures and their absolute inerrancy, the imminent second coming of Jesus Christ, the virgin birth of Jesus Christ, the resurrection, and the atonement. They promote the family and condemn teachings of evolution. Fundamentalists interpret scripture in a racist fashion, stating it is the will of God that blacks serve whites. Now, maps show Baptists were concentrated in the South, where English royalties and traders bred slaves to work on agricultural plantation colonies and other commercial enterprises. This black area over here is Black South, Black Baptist, the Baptist Church in the South, and that's where slave breeding occurred. Catholicism is concentrated in the Southwest because Catholics enslaved and bred native people of South and Central America and Southwest and North America from the 1500s to the 1800s. So over here we have the Catholics, and those are mostly Hispanics, and they spread up from Mexico and South America, where the Catholic Church bred them. Now this was a little earlier. They were bred, started around 1500, while they started bringing the blacks over here around in the 1600s. So that's a difference of about 100 years. Spanish conquistadors, explorers, and adventurers, such as Christopher Columbus, Cortez Balboa, Pizarro, and other professional soldiers, armed with superior weapons, guns, and attack dogs, invaded and conquered Mexican people in Central America and South America. And then Catholic Jesuit priests came and formed agricultural villages that mined silver and gold that were shipped to Spain. The people served the church because Catholic priests could command the conquistadors. You do what I say or I'll call it back. Then French Bourbon kings became the top European power, and professional French soldiers and Dominican and French Jesuits, administrative priests, established tobacco and sugar plantations. African slaves were imported because the harshness of sugar and tobacco plantations depleted the native population. The Indians couldn't take it. In the early days, people of Robbins had a communistic or community lifestyle. They helped each other, sharing tools, knowledge, a cup of sugar, etc. They had to. They were poor, and sharing was a means of survival. Crime was low. People cared about each other. Some people didn't have locks on their doors, only a piece of rope or string and a nail. Now, Black Baptist churches were established and dominated by descendants of slave breeders and domestic slaves, the house workers of the high yellows. Now, many blacks were just learning or unable to read, and scriptures were not analyzed for deeper meaning, and more importantly, the means for analysis were not available until scientific discoveries began in the 1960s. So the founders of Robbins had faith in God, themselves, and their ability to build a self-governing black community. Faith carried them through. Seeking greater understanding of God in scientific terms was the task of their educated descendants. Now, no people at all coming out of slavery should accept the religion of the slave masters. If it was a true religion, he would not have enslaved them. Okay, the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. The Prohibition Amendment of 1919 became law, largely because of fundamentalists, that was the Baptist Church. Prohibition banned the sale, manufacture, and transport of liquor, and led to organized crime. Prohibition made Al Capone a millionaire. It was a roaring 20s with bathtubs and speakeasies, the Charleston, Model T Fords, and Tommy guns. Corruption on the federal level created the Teapot Dome scandal, in which cabinet officials illegally leased naval oil reserves in Wyoming. So what I'm saying is corruption was throughout the government and in the population. Now, President Calvin Coolidge took office in 1923 and stated, "The business of America is business." Commercial farms began replacing small family farms in the North. Cities grew. Auto sales, radio, sports, and credit skyrocketed. And white America had a high standard of living. People had those little cars. Okay, now, Scientific communities in Europe and America had long accepted concepts of evolution, but Baptist fundamentalists generally lacked an education in science, and/or they feared such teachings would destroy their lifestyle. Now, several southern states passed laws forbidding the teaching of evolution. Now, John Scopes, a young biology teacher, broke the Tennessee law by teaching evolution theory, and the state of Tennessee brought him to trial in 1925. Clarence Darrow was a famous defense attorney was the most famous defense attorney in the United States. And the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, hired him to defend Scopes. The World Christian Fundamentalist Association hired William Jennings Bryan, a former Secretary of State and presidential candidate, to assist the prosecution. Now, Clarence Darrow reduced Bryan's statements to rubbish and revealed Bryan's ignorance and inability to explain fundamentalist teachings. Now, Scopes was found guilty because he had broken the law. The law says you can't teach evolution. But nationwide press coverage of the trial upheld science and academic freedom. They had a field day laughing at the fundamentalists. But people forget, and they did forget. Now, southern states did not change laws, but continued to suppress the study of nature. Now, agriculture began collapsing in 1926 as dust storms and black blizzards covered the Midwest. Now, the dust storms were caused by unscientific management of the land. A lot of topsoil had been used to build sod houses. They had just cut up the ground. And the land had been overgrazed, and there was little grass to hold the soil in place. Massive dust storms forced thousands from their homes, just as the Great Depression began in 1929 with the stock market crash. Stock prices had risen far in excess of real values. Consumer credit and banks were overextended. Now, this is a man driven from his home. Those are side houses. Now, the Great Depression was worldwide. It was a period when physically strong but mentally weak forces attacked the physically weak but mentally strong forces to steal their money and creative ability. Fundamentalists, the Ku Klux Klan, fascism, and Nazism expanded out of the rural areas. The Ku Klux Klan is anti-Semitic, they don't like Jews, anti-black, and anti-Catholic. But the KKK gained influence and control over many city and state governments. 8 lynchings in the South were reported in 1932, and 28 were reported in 1933. Now, blacks fled north in record numbers. The Great Depression deepened, and Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933. A few months later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in as U.S. president. Now, it's almost as if all of these forces, the Depression, the blizzards, Hitler, the Ku Klux Klan, is that they come in a wave, which they do. But we'll talk about that later. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the only 4-term president. He radiated self-confidence and faith in himself as he battled the Great Depression and the rising power of Hitler and barbarism. On his first day in office, Roosevelt tended the spirit of the people. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. FDR held radio fireside chats to rebuild and restore confidence. Later critics held that he created a welfare state, but FDR got the nation back to work. Now, I just love this little picture with him grinning to the side. And I put stars around his head. Okay, now World War II began in 1939, and blacks poured from the South to northern industrial regions seeking wartime employment. In 1943, FDR made concessions to put black men and women in the labor force. Blacks prospered, but racial hostilities and riots broke out, notably in Detroit. Even the North had a segregated society in 1941. Blacks could not live, eat, travel, work, or go to school with the same freedom enjoyed by whites. Black soldiers were made to sit at the back of buses, were barred from hotels and restaurants, picked up for minor offenses, and jailed with no excuse. And these are people, notice these black people standing in line waiting for food and handouts, and in the background there's a sign that says there's no way like the American way, and they got a white family driving in a car. It says world's highest standard of living. These are scenes from World War II. There's Hitler, there's Mussolini. This is the uniform of the United States Army. And this is over in Manila where they're lifting the flag, or is that Manila? Where is it? Iwo Jima. Okay, and these are poor people who suffered in Hitler's concentration camp. And here are the Russians picking up their dead. Okay, now Germany and Japan, the Axis powers, were losing the war. In April of 1945, U.S. forces landed on Okinawa, Japan, and the Japanese government failed. Now the problem of the new Japanese premier was not whether to end the war, but how best to do so. Now Japan was still at peace with the Soviets and decided to ask the Soviets to intercede with the Allies. Now, FDR died in office on April 12, 1945. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, and the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Now, Harry Truman, a high school graduate, became U.S. president upon Roosevelt's death. Now, by the time the atomic bomb was successfully tested, the war in Europe was over. Now, Japan had asked Russia to intercede with them to try to surrender. But a presidential committee recommended that it be used on a military target in Japan as soon as possible. The final decision of when and where to use the atomic bomb was up to me, Truman later remarked. Let there be no doubt about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that it should be used. There was no reason to bomb them. They were trying to surrender. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber dropped a single bomb over Hiroshima. It killed or severely wounded 160,000 civilians and destroyed 4 square miles of the city. Now, Japanese officials were
policies of the Communist Party were national friend.
They didn't know what to do. And a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, and Japan surrendered 5 days later.